one of the things that I took away from this hearing, and I'd never actually heard it before, and I've been covering this for a long time, was that Senator Warner really emphasized to these tech CEOs who were there, and we're talking about, Meta, Microsoft, talking about how, and notably absent was X. X was not formerly known as Twitter, but was emphasizing to them that the 48 hours after the election could be some of the most critical moments where disinformation, misinformation is circulating about, particularly if there's going to be a very, very close election. So, Warner was really calling on these tech CEOs to put in place some procedures to try and intercept or label any kind of misinformation.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle, and I'm joined today by congressional reporter Samantha-Jo Roth. SJ, everybody's talking about the presidential race, but there's also a race for control of the Senate next year. Where do the top races that will sort of decide which party controls the Senate, where do they stand right now?
Well, I think Republicans are really looking at Montana, and they're seeing, Tim Sheehy, their candidate there, is really pulling ahead of incumbent Senator Jon Tester. That is somewhat of a newer development over the last couple of months. Jon Tester has been someone who's been a pretty beloved senator. In that state, so this has been something that they're really focusing on. And when you look at the Senate map overall, and you look at the fact that Joe Manchin is retiring, Jim Justice virtually is going to get that seat. So they really only need one more to push it over the edge, and so Montana looks good. But then when you look at the rest of the Senate map, that is when things don't look as great for Republicans. However, it's still such a favorable map for them, and I think virtually anyone you speak with, whether it's in the Senate, on K Street, these lobbyists, everyone expects that the Republicans are going to take over control of the Senate. But in a couple of races, you're seeing in Arizona, for example, Nevada. In Ohio for now, although that race is getting tighter, the incumbents in those races or in the open races, the Democrats are doing better. Whether that's going to stick is another question, but the majority of them are running behind former President Trump in polling, which is not something that you usually want to see.
Right. I mean, I think that's one of the things that has Republicans concerned, is that so many of their battleground state Senate candidates aren't running as well as Trump is in those states. So they're really reliant in increasingly close states on maybe Trump coattails to pull some of these candidates across the finish line. Yeah,
they're absolutely looking at that. And I think, Senator Tester hasn't been tested in this arena since, I think, 2012 or so, when Barack Obama was running. So I think, he hasn't really been up to a presidential test like this before. So, Republicans are really feeling like this is their biggest chance to finally, boot him from that seat. But you do have other, Senate incumbents that are just doing a lot better, like Bob Casey in Pennsylvania, doing a lot better. We talked about Sherrod Brown, he's still ahead of Bernie Moreno. Those statistics are only getting a little bit closer. But then, you also have the open races like Arizona, where Ruben Gallego is kind of running away with it over Kari Lake, and Michigan, that open seat for Stabenow. Rogers is not doing as well as Slotkin, who is the Democrat there. So I think, it's going to be an interesting election night. I think the odds are that Republicans are going to take the Senate, but the big question is by how much. Margins matter. We see a lot of paralysis in the Senate when there's not, enough. There's not, when the margins are just so thin.
Sure, when they're really tight. So there's one other factor in the election, and this has been brought up in the last two presidential elections, and that's the issue of foreign election interference. And you've written about the Senate Intelligence Committee's concerns in this area. What are some of the things that you're hearing?
Yeah, so I think, these concerns have been going on since 2016. You have this Intelligence Committee that has been largely bipartisan in the upper chamber with Mark Warner, who is the chairman, and then Senator Marco Rubio, who is the co-chairman. But there is some concern that there could be meddling by Iran, Russia, China, And a lot of it has to do with some of these websites that look fake, or they're like, they're emulating a news website, and it looks very scary accurate. So they were talking a lot about that during a hearing. But one of the things that I took away from this hearing, and I'd never actually heard it before, and I've been covering this for a long time, was that Senator Warner really emphasized to these tech CEOs who were there, and we're talking about, Meta, Microsoft, talking about how, and notably absent was X. X was not formerly known as Twitter, but was emphasizing to them that the 48 hours after the election could be some of the most critical moments where disinformation, misinformation is circulating about, particularly if there's going to be a very, very close election. So, Warner was really calling on these tech CEOs to put in place some procedures to try and intercept or label any kind of misinformation. Whether or not they're going to do that is another question, but I'd never really heard until this cycle about how important the misinformation, disinformation was in the 48 hours after the polls closed. It always had been really emphasized before. So that's a really interesting new development, and I think there are some concerns about, if voters are going to trust the outcome of the election.
So Congress is having its usual problems with passing government funding, but there's one big exception to this rule. Talk about that.
Yeah, so today the Senate was able to quickly pass a bill that was set for the Veterans Affairs Department. Basically what is going on is there was I'm not exactly sure exactly what the figure is, maybe $3 billion. There's a shortfall. And a huge part of that has to do with the PACT Act. If you remember, that's the bill that covers the impacts of toxic
burn pits.
Yeah, burn pits. And so there's been a influx of claims that have come from veterans, and the Veterans Affairs Department did not accurately account for this influx. So basically what the House and Senate had to do was they had to pass something very, very quickly to ensure that these veterans would be able to collect their claims, because if they had not done it by the end of this week, by October 1st, they would not be able to collect those. So they were able to do this very quickly. They passed a bill that originated in the House. It did have some oversight measures, tucked into it. But I think the big picture is that lawmakers on both sides of the aisle are pretty fed up. They're fed up that the VA did not account for this, and this is not a position that they want to be in, specifically when you look at those senators who are budget hawks, deficit hawks, who are pretty pissed off that they did not account for this.
Well, that's the general mood in Washington right now.
Yep, it is.
Thank you, SJ.
Thank you.
You can read Samantha-Jo and the rest of our political team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.